Good evening, everyone. It's my privilege to introduce Gloria, who is, as was just said, an instructor in film, TV, and media studies in the School of Film and Television here at LMU, a position she has held for 12 years. And she also currently serves on the Faculty Senate. Some of the classes she's taught in her time here at LMU include World Cinema 2, the Psychological Thriller, Seminar in American Film, New Korean Cinema, and the dual author-auteur courses on An Lee and Bong Joon-ho, and David Fincher and Park Chan-wook. She is the author of Elizabeth Taylor, Icon of American Empire, published in 2023, which is the first full-length critical study of the star's multiple images and films. Gloria has been featured on NPR, and her work has been featured in the Los Angeles Times and in the journal Reconstruction Studies in Contemporary Culture. While Gloria frequently teaches courses on Asian cinema and American cinema, her research focus is on iconic, beautiful women and the essential role they play in global visual culture, in cinema and now outside of it. I'd also like to say Gloria is a big NFL fan, and her advice to all is never bet against Mahomes. He is, as she says, the Elizabeth Taylor of the NFL. And without further ado, I invite Gloria up.
Everybody, thank you so much for joining me. It's really a pleasure to be able to share my work with everyone here, and I think I'd really like to extend my gratitude to the library and everyone in the library, particularly Dean Brambolini, Rhonda, Ray, John, and all the folks who help support such wonderful programming. As a faculty member at LMU, I think it's really important for us to be able to share scholarship, especially because quite often in our own teaching, we can't always we're always serving our departments and our chairs, and to best serve the curriculum doesn't necessarily mean that we can actually lean into our personal research in our teaching lives. So it was really important for me to relate to our students, particularly in the School of Film and Television, that academic work is very passionate work. It's very expressive work, and it's very creative work, and we feel as passionately about our academic research and our writing as you guys do about your filmmaking and your quote-unquote creative projects. So it's really so wonderful for me to be able to relay that to you, and also to be able to really kind of reframe the larger notion of the film worker as a genius who is not a male director, right? And to think about this movie star as an incredibly important figure in 20th century popular culture, American film history, but also as a figure who's an ideological text unto herself, that her film work and her images have a lot to sort of teach us and to tell us about American culture in the American century, when really America was the most powerful nation in the world, and she was actually the most famous woman across the world at that time. And so to really think about her through the lens of American power was really important to me, and I think that really helps fill up a gap of knowledge of how we understand her, right? So what was really fascinating for me while I began this project was that there wasn't really that much academic scholarship about Elizabeth Taylor. There have been countless biographies that were really trade books that were really, really interesting because her life was so incredibly sexy and interesting. But for the most part, in terms of academia and within the Film Academy, how she was being read was through the lamp of camp, right? And so, and while camp objects and the theory of camp itself is incredibly pleasurable and really useful for us to understand pop culture, it really kind of framed her through the notion of artistic failure, right? Because that's really a grounding principle of camp, that we enjoy things because they're bad, that they're tacky, that they're excessive, that they're messy, that they're artificial. And really, I thought that was really unfair to really only think of Elizabeth Taylor through that prism, because of the fact that she was incredibly successful, right? And she was famous across the world because she was so extraordinary, right? My parents, who were Korean immigrants, who were children of the Korean War, actually knew who Elizabeth Taylor was, and you didn't have to tell them anything about her, and they appreciated her beauty and her fame and understood exactly why she was famous. She was famous because she was wonderful, right? And it wasn't because they were being inundated and assaulted by tabloid news that they couldn't filter out. It was because she was extraordinary. People outside the Western Hemisphere, even if they didn't have full access to American cinema, knew who she was. My mother actually said once, oh, Elizabeth Taylor didn't really even need to be in movies. She was so beautiful and she had married 8 times. Everyone should know who she was. And I think there's something to that, to say that because of the fact that she was so outrageous, because of the fact that she lived without shame, she was really an aberrant kind of figure, even in the world of Hollywood cinema, and even in the world of stardom. And so I think to really kind of take her seriously was really part of my task, right? And it was really important for me to kind of think about her and really think about her in the times in which she lived and worked. And so to kind of think about her through the 50s, when she was really that last generation of star, when the studio system was really kind of coming apart, and really the larger industry was really embracing independent productions and a new phase called New Hollywood. Through the lens of the civil rights movement in the 1960s, when she was really the most famous woman in the world, to really think about her and the work that she was doing, and really her kind of global adventures as a world traveler and a jet setter during the era of decolonization, and to really think about her as an outrageous consumer and shopper during the Cold War, and really as an unequivocal and unapologetic AIDS activist during the first cycle of the AIDS epidemic in the United States, right? And through that long timeline of great fame and also notoriety and infamy, we kind of think about her, we can really think about her as allegorical to American empire at the height of its power, to really think about really how her film works were really colonial texts that were really imperialistic, that were really kind of invested in framing American viewers and also viewers across the world, and remapping a notion of the global South, not only in the American South through her plantation films in the 1950s, but also she was a kind of plantation mistress that was a kind of figure that repicturized Southeast Asia as a space of white fantasy, white romance, white prosperity, and really a space in which white identity could be properly modeled and policed, right? She was also someone who we can name as cinema's greatest Cleopatra, in which she was so incredibly famous for that role that she actually spurred on a global phenomenon, a kind of outbreak of Egyptomania where Western women were really embracing trends that they had seen her modeling as Cleopatra with the geometric haircuts, with the makeup, with the snake jewelry, and of course because it's the year of the snake, that snake jewelry is coming back again. She was really kind of doing that she was being that figure of fantasy when the world was actually decolonizing. Right? By 1960, 25 nations in Africa were decolonizing while the world was getting a version of an aberrant white Cleopatra that was very much embracing a kind of visual Orientalism that spurred on white women to really embrace that kind of consumption and that kind of a sense of sexual liberation that I think is very, very fascinating. Of course, even while she was the most successful woman actress in the 1960s, she's someone who actually negotiated for her major contract for Cleopatra for $1 million, but she ended up making $14 million because of all the overtime overpay, and she had back-end points because she was so smart. And so, according to Google, that $14 million in our money is actually equivalent to $140 million.
Wow.
Right? Because she was that smart. Wow. And she knew her value. Even though she was very successful in the 60s, she ended up winning 2 Academy Awards in that decade. By the 70s, her career was really waning down, and she was someone who actually exited Hollywood cinema. And you must kind of consider the fact that she was actually bigger than Hollywood movies, and she didn't really need them to really buttress up her image. She was someone who understood that film trends were changing, and also the kind of melodramas we were used to seeing beautiful women in were no longer being produced. They were really making, 1970s American cinema was really obsessed with men in crisis. Right? And she was also getting older and aging, and so for the most part she wasn't really making films. But by the 1980s, with the AIDS crisis, she understands this is really now my life's purpose. I really want to be able to be an activist, to advocate for gay men dying of AIDS, to humanize them, and I know how to do this. Right? She actually really, ends up really doing a form of performance art that's really extensive and really masterful. She actually loses weight, she goes to rehab, and embraces monogamy, matrimony, sobriety, and really her 1950s corporeal dimensions to be able to kind of, because of the fact that the US itself was really embracing a very conservative kind of 1950s politics, right? And so she was someone who was performing as a kind of maternal figure for patients with AIDS. She was actually in front of Congress and the UN testifying and really being a kind of vocal figure and a visual figure to secure funds at a federal level and also on the ground by really making sure that AIDS activism could be a form of consumption for people who wanted to be supported, right? So through all of these moments, we really kind of see her performative genius and really her understanding of a very conservative kind of audience, and also really her understanding of her own body as a kind of instrument that was really serving not only her films but also her work as someone outside the screen who was much bigger than Hollywood cinema. And so I thought it would be really wonderful, again, to kind of see her on film. So I wanted to really share a clip with you from 1958's Cat on a Hot Tin Roof. Because again, it's a way to kind of think about how beauty is a kind of building block for Hollywood cinema, how beauty is at the service of particular ideological ends, and how beauty makes Hollywood cinema that much more magical, right? And I think it's going to be even more pronounced because Cat on a Hot Tin Roof really pairs Elizabeth Taylor with Paul Newman, right? And so you're going to get double eye orgasms, right? And it's also kind of amazing that the director, Richard Brooks, insisted that the film be in color, in Metro color, so that we can see how blue their eyes were, right? And so you're going to notice that Paul Newman has Swiss topaz blue eyes, Elizabeth Taylor has sapphire blue eyes, right? So slightly different, but very beautiful. The film itself is very theatrical, right? But you're going to notice that it's basically a filmed play. It's very verbose. There's a lot of dialogue. And what you're going to notice that Elizabeth Taylor is a very technical actress. The fact that she's actually a very able scene partner with Paul Newman, that their energy level and their tonal and their tones are very symmetrical and complementary. She's someone who actually is a very fascinating figure as a performer because of the fact that she's not going to turn into Maggie the Cat. She's going to allow Maggie the Cat to be a little bit more like Elizabeth Taylor. Right? And so you're going to really also notice that Elizabeth Taylor is going to feel Maggie's feelings at the time, at the moment, in a very realistic and natural way, the way that she's supposed to feel them. So why don't we take a look at this clip? Clip really demonstrates how important movie stars are and how they really are, they help elevate Hollywood cinema to a kind of different kind of level of magic. And I think it's a bit more obvious, maybe not so much obvious, but I think it helps that Paul Newman is also there because we already take for granted that young Elizabeth Taylor is going to be very beautiful, right? But to see a male beauty like Paul Newman really working in conjunction with her. And the fact that their beauty is really in the service of promoting capitalism. I mean, this is still a story about a son who's about to be disinherited from his very rich father, who has to, who ends up reconciling with him and then is reinserted into the proper cycle of inheritance, is really a story about money. Right? And to sort of see these beautiful people really promoting money, I think, is important to know.
Hi everyone, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here and delighted to be in conversation with Professor Shin. And I was looking at the screen because I wanted to start with this image. And I'm a big fan of physical copies of books, so I brought this physical copy to show you all. That was the image also on the screen. So Gloria, can you tell us a little bit about this amazing cover? That was my first question.
I just knew that the cover had to be lilac because purple is an imperial color and is one of her signature colors. And that her face had to be on the cover. And what's so funny is that when I was working with Getty Images and also the publisher, and they were formatting the cover, they would cut off one of her eyes. So we couldn't get both eyes on the cover. I couldn't believe it. It was horrible. But I'm glad I stuck to my guns because what a wonderful treat to see her like this again. And it gives me inordinate amounts of pleasure to see her and and to have her name and my name on the cover as well.
I was sold. So I wanted to talk a little bit from the perspective of our discipline about the film star. So what is a film star? I mean, a very basic question. And why is Elizabeth Taylor important as a star?
Right. I think that Richard Dyer is a British scholar who really put star studies as a subfield in film studies on the map, and he sort of has these really useful theories about stardom, including that they're figures that make difficult things look very easy. Right? They have a kind of mastery of performance. There's also other theories of star of how they move their body, and they have a kind of corporeal charisma. But for me, my understanding of the star is they are extraordinary figures, but they, like films themselves, are ideological texts. That they have their images project a kind of meaning that kind of naturalizes that meaning over time, that become very, very fascinating and say something important about culture. For me, I think stars also are very much models of identity and practice, which is what I write about in my book. And by that I mean that they actually perform. I think Elizabeth Taylor performs white femininity in a kind of extraordinary way that makes her a figure of fantasy, for instance, right? And so that's a kind of working definition of stardom that I want to further cultivate as I continue on with my research.
Right. Thank you. And also, as a female star, what makes Elizabeth Taylor's work, her entire oeuvre, so significant about a male star, for example? Because male stars typically are paid more. So I was just wondering, and I was glad you were talking about money earlier.
Yes. I think that for one thing, she's an aberration in so many ways, but I think because of the fact that she actually survived the studio system, and she actually evolved as a figure and as a set of images, because she didn't die of a drug overdose in the 1960s, for instance. She was also kind of punished for that because she actually grew old, because she was allowed to age, because she had survived. She had also gained weight. And so because in the 70s moment, she was a bigger kind of corporeal figure, she was sort of considered a kind of failure. But she also understood, and I think was in particular an author of her image in particular ways, understanding that she had her film work, but that she was also someone who wasn't really assigned interesting parts. Like she wasn't. Even as a beautiful woman, there are other beautiful women that we know that are muses for auteurs. Right? Even someone like Grace Kelly, whose career wasn't that long, was a Hitchcock blonde. Catherine Deneuve has worked with multiple auteurs. Gongley, also a beautiful woman, has worked with many auteurs, but Elizabeth Taylor, for the most part, is more famous than any of her directors. And so I think that for her, there's a multiplicity of images that make her really, really interesting and not typical because of the fact that she did not die young. She aged, and she also saw life outside cinema. Right? She exited cinema, and she was much more. She was both a tabloid figure, but also a kind of. She was writing her own hagiography by really embracing a larger cause and a political cause that she earnestly very much believed in, and was such a successful fundraiser and activist that really changed our understanding of people with AIDS. And to this day, I think we're really, for the most part, experiencing the gains of her work, right?
Exactly, very unusual for women of her generation. And on that note, I also wanted to return to the title of the book, which is Elizabeth Taylor, Icon of American Empire. I was wondering if you could break down for us what's American about her and what's the empire.
Well, I think that in some ways she, as a movie star whose image was being transmitted across the world, across screens, I think that she is a kind of, for better or worse, a kind of ambassador of Americanness. And I think that what was really interesting about her film works was that they were really films about the plantation, which is part of American history, American colonial history, and it was really interesting that her participation in plantation films as a plantation mistress was really kind of a nostalgic term back to plantation logic for American audiences and also audiences across the world. As the first major economy that helped found the United States, it was very interesting that these films were being produced by Hollywood while America was really rising as a global superpower. And so I thought that was incredibly meaningful, especially also because it was really the tail end of the studio system. And so there was a nostalgic look at Hollywood cinema being capable of producing a surplus with their films, right? And so I think that aspect of her work was very, very American. But I think she was also someone who embraced a kind of globalism, and she was a kind of world traveler. She was someone who was very much interested in exploring. She was someone who really relished her kind of global safari that she was on when she was a 60s and a kind of 70s star. She was someone who debated whether to have British citizenship because she didn't want to pay American taxes. She was someone who also changed religion. She's someone who converted to Judaism. And she was someone who was really remaking even her sense of her own whiteness and her racial identity in the late 50s into the 60s that I think was very, very interesting. She was someone who was openly and loved being exotic, right? To a way that really kind of made her an icon that was really much bigger than what Hollywood films were doing, ultimately.
Yeah, and speaking of that, Cleopatra, her most Oriental
Yes,
film. Can
yes.
you say a little bit about her Orientalist performance?
Right. What's really interesting about Cleopatra is the fact that, of course, I think scholars of Middle East studies also understand the Middle East and North Africa as a major kind of fantastical site that really is a kind of a staging area for notions of American identity at a particular time, especially because of the fact that the U.S. military has always staged, seemingly, so many military campaigns in the Middle East, right? Whether to secure oil or what have you. And so what was really fascinating was that in 1963, when Cleopatra was finally released, when there was such a kind of open political shift to decolonization, filmgoers across the world were having access to a particular kind of Cleopatra who was phenotypically white, but was really considered an aberration by the Roman men who disliked her, right? And she was someone who, her character of Cleopatra wanted to build a kind of new world order where an Eastern Egypt and a Western Rome could actually come together harmoniously. Which is an interesting message within the film itself. But of course, her Cleopatra is actually punished for that kind of thinking because she's such an unruly kind of figure, right? And so there are these hopes of a kind of unity of East and West. But again, her performance is very, very interesting. I think masterful. When she's not on screen in that movie, it falls apart completely. It's not worth watching when she's not there. But also, it is a very feminine, hyper-feminine centered universe based on Elizabeth Taylor-Niss, right? Everyone who comes into contact with this is obsessed with her. And I think that the film actually really, I think, speaks to her own sense of her place in the world, in the sense that I think America itself was getting too small. I think that those larger kind of the policing of American women and in terms of just being a kind of staid housewife, those things were never really a part of her reality anyway. But I think that because of the fact that the world itself was opening up with decolonization, she was also someone who considered herself as a global citizen.
Which is irresistible.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So, but there's also another side to her, as you mentioned, the AIDS activism, which was also very, very unusual, and she was really going against the grain. And another place that you talk about in your book, where she goes against the grain, is through her maternal image, which is a direct contrast to the exotic, desirable image of Cleopatra. So could you say a little bit about that?
Right. I think what's so interesting about her is that, granted, she was married 8 times to 7 men. She was divorced 7 times. She had 4 children who adored her. She was a working mother. And when she was dying, when they announced, her family got together and announced her death and spoke very lovingly about her. There's archival evidence of her children looking adoringly up at her on film sets. So she herself was, and there's never been and there will never be a Mommy Dearest kind of expose memoir that her children, her grandchildren write about her. She was an incredibly affectionate and loving mother. And I think that we see certain parts in her filmography in the 1950s, for instance, Giant, where she plays a very loving and understanding and liberal mother to the Dennis Hopper character who does not want to be a rancher but wants to be a medical doctor. So I think that she's had so many spaces of practice to be an embracing, loving, compassionate mother, especially when the child is considered different. And I think that she was already kind of, there's already that kind of muscle memory with her, and I think she was a very passionate mother. She was also an adoptive mother because she wanted more children. So I think that when she was embracing her AIDS activism, really kind of standing in for mothers, and she would be a mother that Congress would take seriously, right? When she testifies in front of them for funding for all those patients dying of AIDS. I think it feels like a contradiction in some ways, but I think there's also other parts of her persona and her personal life that speak to her open embrace of motherhood.
Do we have time for one more question?
Yeah, plenty of time. You have until about 6:30.
6:30?
Yep.
Oh, so we have a lot
At
of
least 10
time.
minutes if you want. We're a little bit ahead of schedule, but plenty of time.
Okay, so I wanted to also, since most of us don't realize how much of our time goes into writing a book, it's really a chunk of our life. So I was wondering if you could tell us, how you started writing the book, how you thought of Elizabeth Taylor, and how long the writing process took. It's really laborious, so I wanted to hear about that.
I think that I always kind of knew who Elizabeth Taylor was. And I think it's because I saw her playing Cleopatra on television. I'm a local of Los Angeles, so we all watch KTLA. And because Cleopatra is such a long movie, it's 4 hours long with commercials, it's a whole day of programming, I would see it on KTLA from time to time. And I guess I always knew of her existence, and it's a very hyper-feminine, very beautiful film. So I think I always thought of her as incredibly special. And I think when I was getting ready to do research to make a contribution to our discipline, I realized that there wasn't really good scholarship about her, and that I really wanted to take her work seriously. But I mean, I think, as I like to relate to our students, really writing about film is really thinking about film. And so for the most part, it takes a lot of just obsessive thinking to get a project off the ground. First and foremost, I think it's important to kind of understand if there's gaps of knowledge and to really ground research in archival research. But once I really understood what her image meant and that she had a deep connection to American empire and power, then the writing became much easier. And then my committee and I, people who were kind of my mentors, we decided that, well, it should be 4 chapters, and really thinking about her not chronologically, but in terms of her film work, because she made a genre of plantation films that was very important. Her Cleopatra time was incredibly important. Her AIDS activism was incredibly important, and also just what her beauty means was also incredibly fascinating and important, especially because she's not the blonde star. Right, and when Hollywood launches stars, for the most part, it means a Hollywood blonde every decade, right? And so sometimes those blondes are no longer American. We have Australian blondes like Margaret Robbie and Charlize Theron before her from South Africa. But for the most part, they want blondes, and also women get blonder as they get more famous. They get thinner and paler and blonder. Elizabeth Taylor said, no, I'm going to tan, and my hair is very dark, and we're going to keep it dark, right? So the fact that she's embracing a darker kind of beauty made her also very significant, particularly for audiences who were the children of immigrants, who were ethnic white immigrants, or women of color, who really looked to her as a kind of icon of beauty. So I think that's also very significant. And so that sort of made up the 4 chapters. And for the most part, once I understood the project, it took about a year of writing. Yeah,
that's quick. But yeah, one of the strengths of this book is exactly that, and it's what makes it different from a biography, is that you cover all of these themes that run through the entire oeuvre of work that she produced, whether it's Orientalism or having dark hair and dark eyes, the plantation films, the AIDS activism, and I don't think, as you mentioned, there's enough work on Elizabeth Taylor, and this is one of the most significant books on Elizabeth Taylor. So we're really lucky to have Gloria talking to us about this today. And I also, speaking of that, I wanted to talk about, the life that she has outside of a film per se, which is the cosmetic empire. She reinvents herself as this queen.
Yes.
How do you position that?
Again, she is an innovator, an architect, a legend, right? In cosmetics, she was the first major star to have a namesake, a celebrity fragrance, which becomes a genre in the fragrance industry. And she was very hands-on in terms of creating the scents, formulating them, designing the bottles, and naming them. And so the first major fragrance is, of course, Passion. Comes from the purple bottle, which is her signature color. And what was really masterful, and really this is where she should have earned her Oscars, was that she was in a perfume commercial and she didn't come off as a buffoon, right? She was quoting Shakespeare because of her connection to Richard Burton, who's a very famous Shakespearean actor, and she doesn't come off as an idiot, a pretentious idiot. It was just very charming. She kept it moving, and it was great. White Diamonds is her blockbuster fragrance that she sold $1 billion worth of this fragrance, and her actual White Diamonds kind of launches and her promotion actually coincides with the height of her AIDS activism, right? And so every Christmas, there used to be a commercial of White Diamonds that as soon as I learned that she died, I said, oh my God, is this ruining Christmas? Will I see these commercials? And they do play them on television, and I'm very grateful that I see her like that.
Thank you. So, thank you very much for talking to us. I think we can take questions.
Again, thank you to Dr. Anupama Prabhala for leading today's discussion. My friend Chan Harris is setting up a microphone for anybody who might have a question for our speakers today. Already somebody heading towards the microphone. Dr. Anna.
Hi, Dr. Shin. Thank you very much for an interesting topic. I was wondering, so if you can elaborate more on the topic of she used her body as a tool, you mentioned. So because in 1970, I was even not born yet. And even now, under the Trump administration, to be a woman is very challenging. The DEI is eliminated, the right of abortion. It's very hard to be a woman even now in 2025. Can you elaborate more the challenges she faced at that time in 1970? And you just mentioned she's amazing, but how go through all of those challenges?
Right.
Thank you very much.
I think that there's a famous quote from Betty Davis that I think is also a tribute to Elizabeth Taylor about stardom. And she said something like, if you're not a monster, you're nobody, right? That you really have to be a kind of monstrous figure within the industry itself to hold your own ground, because you're going to be intimidated, you're going to be possibly abused by film moguls and men who really profit off of your image, right? And who want to police your body, who want to say, this is how you should look, this is how much you should weigh. If you don't look like this or weigh this much, we're not going to put you in a film, right? And so she was someone who was keenly aware of this because she grew up in the studio system as a child. She's someone who was a star of National Velvet at 12 years old. That really launched her career. And so she was someone who very much was a kind of animal within this ecosystem, but by the time that she actually reaches adulthood, she becomes an apex predator within that ecosystem, right? Because people, directors, studio heads were falling over backwards to try to please her. And she actually, because of her kind of box office appeal, because of the fact that she has an extra cinematic life to her in which people care about everything she's doing, including the men that she's dating. She was an incredibly impressive person. And she was someone who was unafraid to negotiate her own contracts because of the fact that this is labor, and they're making a lot of money off of her, right? And so she was someone who, and I think, and one way to explain this, maybe it's that she was just built differently. I mean, psychologically, she had the kind of psychological makeup to be able to handle this and to survive and to really, you know, as an object of desire, she was someone who actually was a very desiring figure, right? There was a kind of symmetry that she had found, a global kind of universal balance to kind of keep herself alive and sane. Is that while people are desiring her and caring so much about what she was doing, she also lived a life of pleasure and desire, right? And maybe there were moments in some years where it was destructive, where she was abusing alcohol and drugs, but she also managed to survive.
Thank you so much for doing this. One of the great pleasures of these nights is being able to actually hear fabulous professors in your own department talk and teach. As a professor, it's like, oh, this is what's going on in these other classrooms. It's incredible. Really, really special. I have like 75 questions, but I will try to limit myself. And you talked a little bit about the span of her career, which is just astounding. And you know, to survive being a child actor and make it into your 20s is amazing. To survive being a child actor and make it into your 80s, especially with your children appreciating you, is extraordinary. And I'm curious about if there was a way that she talked about kind of survival in the industry, or if she ever talked about like what that, and I mean, I guess you've already mentioned a little bit of these kinds of philosophies, but I'm just curious of how her personality or the versions of her changed from childhood into that, like kind of the ingenue and, you know, into, you know, something like Cat on the Hot Tin Roof, where she's hyper sexualized. And then I was also curious about if you could talk a little bit about more, I had always heard that it was really about her relationship with Rock Hudson that brought her into the AIDS kind of campaign and activism, but it was there kind of more to that, because I'm just curious about where or how activism kind of played into her life, whether or not she was ever kind of politically active at other points, or whether or not it was an all-in with the AIDS activism, or whether it was a kind of gradual process for her.
Right. Thank you for your questions, Miranda, and your support. I'll answer the second question first. In terms of her AIDS activism, she and Rock Hudson, when they were both very young and beautiful, alongside James Dean, were in Marfa, Texas. Is almost the middle of nowhere. Even to this day, it's a very intimate arts community, but it's not a heavily populated area. They were actually shooting Giant together, and they became very, very close friends. It's like, for folks who were not normal people, who didn't go to college, it was like summer camp and freshman year of just bonding, hanging out, making movies. They swore up and down that they invented a drink called a chocolate martini. So they were having a really fun time, and from all accounts, Rock Hudson was a very beloved film figure within, especially amongst his women co-stars. He was a very beloved, welcome family friend, including Lauren Bacall. Doris Day adored him. Elizabeth Taylor also adored him. So I know, while we know that Elizabeth Taylor actually married 7 men, right? And I do write about Richard Burton and her relationship with him in my book because it's so significant. I think one of the more significant relationships she ever had was with Rock Hudson. I think because Rock Hudson loved her and she loved Rock Hudson, when she realized that Rock Hudson was dying like this and that he was getting no support, when he was hoping to seek treatment and a last-ditch effort to go to France, that he had to rent a private Air France plane to try to get treatment. She realized that she had to do something for him, and so that's where it comes from. But ironically, before that, her kind of foray into politics was supporting her husband, John Warner, the Republican senator from Virginia, who was Secretary of the Navy. And then she campaigned very heavily for him and successfully campaigned for him. And then he becomes that sitting senator for decades upon decades. And what he really does with his time in the Senate was he was the head of the Joint Armed Forces Committee and really secured a lot of military contracts for the state of Virginia. So in one sense, it's very conservative. In the other sense, it is not. right? And so she's a very complicated and interesting kind of figure in that way. In terms of her kind of evolution as a star and as an icon, what's interesting is that even though she was famous for so long, like almost about 70 years, her film career actually did not span 30 years, even though she started out as a young child, right? And I think it really speaks to how, as a woman who's really cast to play, who's not only a beautiful woman, but on screen is really designated to play beautiful women. Like, your parts are limited and your time on screen is limited, even for her. And so she's someone who actually, because of the fact that when she was 17, she looked 24, or she was playing older parts, she never really had awkward years where she could seamlessly, in some ways, make that transition from child actress to adult film roles with leading men who were 20 years older than her. So there wasn't really gaps in that regard, and she was always a professional. Like, she could do things in one take. She would astonish her directors and her DPs by knowing how far cameras were away from her, by the heat of the lights against her face. She was someone who was, a prodigy that became a genius, and because she was such a good worker and so good at her job, she kept working for the most part until she sort of aged out of it, right? And I think that, people have stories of her being a delightful child, and then stories about her being a star who really couldn't be bossed around. And when she was 14 years old, and it's something that peaked a little early, she was on the set of, she was someone, her mother was a very famous stage mother, and she did not like Louis B. Mayer because Louis B. Mayer was very unkind to her mother, and she as a little girl, allegedly cussed him out. And then when she was actually promoting Father of the Bride and Harry Truman was president, she didn't like Harry Truman because he looked like Louis B. Mayer. So she had bad memories of that, but she held her ground even as a little girl. Please don't talk to my mother like this, right? So she was always a tough little girl, and that was just naturally her mental makeup.
I have a question. I would just want to say, first off, thank you very much. As someone who didn't know too much about Elizabeth Taylor, it was amazing to hear about her illustrious career and life. I have two questions. One, was there any preconceptions you had about Elizabeth Taylor and herself that changed over the course of writing the book as you gathered research and everything? And then my second, as a screenwriting major, I would love to hear what was the biggest challenge and kind of triumph in your kind of authoring this book.
Right. I think for the most part, Elizabeth Taylor is a very earnest star. And for the most part, she was very honest about her mistakes. She was very honest and she lived without shame. And so the work itself that I'm doing is actually reading her image and the image that she helped create about herself that projected across the world. And so maybe the hardest thing for the most part, I didn't have too many preconceived notions that were debunked by my research. I had a clearer sense of who she was because she wanted us to know who she was. That was really part of her work as a performer. But the hardest thing about something like this is just finishing it, right? It's starting and finishing it. And for the most, you could keep writing forever, but it's always important to kind of set up personal deadlines for yourself and to meet them and to continue writing and to really thinking and to really write about something that you love, that you could be obsessed about, because it's such a passionate work. And it's something that when you're writing it and it's not finished, it's living with you right here, over your head until it's done. And so I would encourage for those of you who are interested in this kind of work to pick something that you really care about and that you love, that it gives you pleasure to think about, because there are going to be times when it's hard. But again, it's such a great joy to be able to give the world knowledge, especially about someone that people think that they've known forever or know so much about.
Hi.
Hi.
As one of your students, I just want to say thank you for telling us about this event and inviting us. I'd never been to one before, but I'm gonna come again. It was awesome. But I wanted to ask, just as someone who's spent so much time thinking about Elizabeth Taylor, as you said, to write this whole book, is there anything that you think you've learned from her, or that you really admire about her, or something you've maybe taken from her life and tried to implement it into your own, or anything like that?
Oh, I think living without shame is wonderful, right? But I think it's really, really hard, right? So I think that, and also the fact that she has a kind of sense of generosity and a generosity of spirit is, I think, incredibly wonderful. And even though she was quite wealthy and people said she could afford to be generous to her friends or people she met, but it doesn't mean that every wealthy person is generous, right? And so I think that it's quite wonderful that she is incredibly generous, and I think that I want to be more of a generous person as well.
Can I not get up? Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, you can.
No, you go.
No, it's fine. You can, it's really, I can wait. All right.
Hi, Devin.
Hey, I wanted to also thank you for the invite. This has been a very enjoyable event. It's nice hearing you talk about this subject you put so much time and effort into. So I wanted to ask, having gone through Elizabeth Taylor's history, both personal and acting, and the going through her filmography with it, do you think there is a part of her filmography that is most overlooked relative to, in your opinion, the significance of it to her overall career and self as a person?
Right, I think that's a great question, thank you. I think that hopefully my book sort of remedies this and really takes her kind of her Plantations films, which are Elephant Walk, Giant, Raintree County, Cleopatra is also a plantation film. Cat on a Haunted Roof is also a plantation film. For people to really think about them as ideologically rich texts at a very pivotal time in in the days of American Empire. I would love for more scholarship towards those films. I'm grateful to a generation of Chicano scholars who are very much interested in reading and unpacking Giant, for instance, but for the most part, there isn't that much scholarship. I would also love for Criterion to remaster and release her films. I would also love an American postage stamp to be issued in her name. I would also love the Palm Springs Airport to be renamed in her honor by her 100th birthday, which is 2032. But in terms of just, I think I would hope that there's more interest in her film work, right? And I think really kind of taking those films out and really kind of remastering them and re-promoting them again would, I think, be really, really a first step.
So the one film that you haven't mentioned, and for those, oh man.
Yeah. Okay, go Roma.
So one film is A Place in the Sun
Yes.
with Montgomery Clift,
Yes.
which I think is the perfect
Yes.
Elizabeth Taylor film. I mean, it is her at her absolute most gorgeous.
Yes.
It is the very important relationship with Montgomery Clift that also led to her activism with AIDS. So I would, anybody who is thinking about learning more about her, please watch that film. But the other thing is that she was so interesting in my opinion because, as you mentioned, she started out about the same time as Judy Garland as a child star, but she had the brains and the difference in her that was really a survivor and a really intelligent survivor. She was also widowed at a very young age, and that was traumatic, and that I think brought a lot of attention to her. But she always kept on, you're right, she just kept moving along, and whatever happened, she fought through it in so many ways. So thank you for bringing her to our attention, and to maybe some people who don't know enough about her, maybe they will be encouraged to watch her films.
Thank you so much.
We have a lot of them in our collection.
I don't have to do that anymore, guys.
Any more questions?
Spirit.
Can I just ask a question about so, I mean, what's so interesting about her
I think it's
form-
important for recording, so that's why.
Sorry.
Chan's running
I
over.
tried, it
I
didn't work.
understand, yeah.
We don't want to miss you.
So what's so interesting about the kind of power, right, that she has within Hollywood is this association with hyperfemininity and money, right? And in many ways, I think she prefigures a kind of form of feminism, right, that we get in the 1990s,
Yes.
right, up until today. So I'm curious to know how you think Elizabeth Taylor helps us understand these icons of femininity and economy, right? So
Right.
like we mentioned Kim Kardashian, right, as a kind of example of this, right? But how can Elizabeth Taylor help us understand these icons of feminine power today?
Right. What a great question. Thank you, Mickey. She herself would never name herself as a feminist, right? She's of that generation where it's a dirty and it's a kind of taboo term. And she was a hyper feminine woman. She loved her motherhood. She loved getting married to men. She loved makeup. She loved jewelry. She loved beautiful clothes. But I think that what's interesting about her is that she's a kind of she makes it at least possible to imagine a hyper-feminine woman being very powerful, and she's not a masculine woman, right? She's not really mimicking or performing a kind of a masculine persona, but she's unapologetically hyper-feminine. So I think at a kind of base level, she sort of shows you that it's possible, but she's also one of one, right? Like no one really looks like that. No one really behaves like that. Even though she comes from a generation where there were so many beautiful women in Hollywood cinema, she's someone who survived because of the fact that she was just tougher, stronger, more bombastic, and she, again, I think there's a kind of strength to being shameless in a way that I think is wonderful, right? It's really liberating, and she's a unique combination of those qualities that helped her really be an icon. But again, I think, you're making me realize that really her hyperfemininity and is really not a detriment, right? It's something that really makes her, men are in awe of her, right? And she's someone who, again, because of the fact that it's a natural kind of expression of herself and her identity, I think that's why it's so effective, right? She's an incredibly earnest performer, and I think that's what makes her so great on screen and so great off the screen.
So Kim Kardashian's not the same.
No, but it's so incredible that, again, she's modeling a kind of stardom for so many women, and she's been dead since 2011, right? She's the architect of feminine stardom in a particular way that's based on beauty, right? And there is a shelf life tied to beauty. And what I like the most about her is, of course, I love looking at her image because it gives me so much pleasure, but being beautiful is the least interesting thing about her. She's done so much more with her life. She's interested in so many other things. Her kind of personality, her quotable quotes, like her charisma is really based on something, not just on beauty.
Any more questions? Okay. If not, can you all please help me thank Dr. Gloria?